Led to more than 30 arrests in the last week, and more are expected. Authorities say it's a blow to the Blood family mafia, a street gang believed to be behind a string of violent.
Montreal, August 9th, 1995. 11-year-old Daniel Desrochers was playing outside his home when a car bomb exploded across the street. Metal shrapnel tore through the air, striking the boy in the head. 4 days later, on August 13th, Daniel was dead. This wasn't some random act of terror. This was the bloody reality of the Quebec Biker War, the deadliest motorcycle club conflict in history. What started as a business dispute over drug territories had turned Montreal's streets into a war zone. But this wasn't just about the notorious Hells Angels trying to expand their empire. This was about a smaller, hungrier club called the Rock Machine that refused to bow down. A club that would challenge the Angels' dominance and temporarily seize control of Canada's billion-dollar drug trade. For 8 years, these two clubs would tear Quebec apart. Over 160 people would die. Hundreds more would be wounded. The violence would be so intense that it would force the government to rewrite Canada's criminal laws. But in the middle of this chaos, something extraordinary happened. The Rock Machine, against all odds, managed to take over significant portions of the drug trade that the Hells Angels had controlled for decades. This is the true story of how a motorcycle club born from betrayal grew powerful enough to challenge one of the world's most feared criminal organizations, and how they used violence, strategic alliances, and pure determination to carve out their own empire in the shadows of Canadian crime. The foundation, setting the stage. To understand how the Rock Machine took over Canada's drug trade, we need to go back to where it all began. The Quebec drug market in the 1990s was worth an estimated $1 billion annually. That's serious money, the kind that men kill for. By 1994, the Hells Angels had already established themselves as the dominant force in Quebec's drug trade. They had arrived in the province back in 1977 when they absorbed a local club called the Popeyes. From that moment, the Angels began systematically building their criminal empire. They controlled the distribution networks, had connections with the Italian mafia for importing drugs, and their puppet clubs handled street-level sales across Montreal and Quebec City. But there was one problem standing in their way of total domination. His name was Salvatore Cazzetta, and he was the founder of the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club. Cazzetta had started the Rock Machine in 1986. And he wasn't just some ordinary criminal. He was well connected to the Rizzuto crime family, Montreal's powerful mafia organization. This connection gave the Rock Machine protection that other clubs didn't have. The Angels knew better than to mess with someone who had the backing of the Italian mob. The drug trade in Montreal worked like this. The mafia handled importation, bringing in cocaine from South America and other drugs from various sources. The motorcycle clubs, primarily the Hells Angels, served as distributors. They would buy drugs from the mafia and then distribute them through their network of puppet clubs and street dealers. Everyone had their territory, and for years there was an uneasy peace. But Maurice "Mom" Bouchier, the ambitious president of the Hells Angels Montreal chapter, had bigger plans. He wanted complete control over Quebec's drug trade, and as long as Salvatore Cazzetta and the Rock Machine existed, that dream couldn't become reality. The opportunity, Cazzetta's downfall. Everything changed in 1994. Salvatore Cazzetta made a fatal mistake. He was arrested at a pit bull farm in Fort Erie, Ontario, charged with attempting to import over 11 tons of cocaine worth $275 million. With their leader facing a 10-year prison sentence in Florida, the Rock Machine was suddenly leaderless and vulnerable. Maurice Boucher saw his opportunity, and he took it. With Cazzetta out of the picture, Boucher began increasing pressure on the Rock Machine. He started deploying his puppet clubs, the Rockers, the Evil Ones, and the Death Riders, to move into territories that had been controlled by the Rock Machine. But Boucher's plan wasn't just about taking over existing territory. He had a much more ambitious goal. He wanted to issue an ultimatum to every drug dealer and criminal organization in Montreal. Buy your drugs exclusively from the Hells Angels, or face the consequences. This wasn't just business. This was about creating a complete monopoly over Quebec's drug trade. If Boucher could control Quebec, he would have a strong enough base to move into Ontario, Canada's biggest drug market. From there, the Hells Angels could potentially control the drug trade across the entire country. The Rock Machine, now led by Cadzetta's brother Giovanni and Claude Vizina, had to make a choice. They could submit to the Angels' demands and essentially become their employees, or they could fight back. They chose to fight. The alliance forms, David versus Goliath. Giovanni Cadzetta wasn't going to let his brother's club be absorbed without a fight, but he was smart enough to know that the Rock Machine couldn't take on the Hells Angels alone. The Angels were larger, wealthier, and better organized. They had more manpower and more resources. So, Giovanni did something brilliant. He used his connections to build an alliance that would resist the Hells Angels' attempt to monopolize Quebec's drug trade. He reached out to other criminal organizations that would be hurt by a Hells Angels monopoly. The result was the Alliance Against the Angels, also known as the Dark Circle. This wasn't just a motorcycle club alliance. This was a coalition of different criminal organizations working together against a common enemy. The alliance included the Rock Machine as the primary fighting force, but also brought in the Pelletier clan, an independent drug trafficking organization led by Sylvain Pelletier. The Dark Circle provided the financial backing. This was a secretive group of Montreal businessmen who owned bars and restaurants that served as fronts for drug sales and money laundering. What made the Dark Circle particularly dangerous was that these weren't typical criminals. These were successful businessmen who had been using their legitimate businesses to launder drug profits for years. They had the financial resources to fund a war against the Hells Angels, and they had everything to lose if the Angels took complete control. The chairman of the Dark Circle was Michel Duclos, who was actually a Montreal schoolteacher by day, but also owned a bar that served as a front for money laundering. These men understood that if the Hells Angels gained a monopoly, they would either be forced out of business or become employees of the Angels. Neither option was acceptable. The war begins. First blood. On July 13th, 1994, 3 masked men walked into a motorcycle shop in Montreal's Rivière-des-Prairies neighborhood. Their target was Pierre Daoust, a member of the Death Riders, one of the Hells Angels puppet clubs. Without warning, they opened fire, killing Daoust instantly. This wasn't random violence. This was a carefully planned assassination that marked the beginning of the Quebec Biker War. The Rock Machine had fired the first shot, and they were sending a clear message: "We will not submit to your ultimatum." The Hells Angels responded quickly. The next day, they attempted to kill a member of the Rockers, another motorcycle club, but the target survived. The same day, Quebec Provincial Police arrested several Rock Machine members who were planning to blow up the clubhouse of the Evil Ones, a Hells Angels puppet club. But the violence was just getting started. On October 19th, 1994, Maurice Lavoie, a drug dealer who had recently switched from buying drugs from the Rock Machine to the Hells Angels, was gunned down in his car. His girlfriend was wounded but survived and was able to identify the shooter as Patrick Call, a member of the Pelletier clan. 9 days later, the Hells Angels struck back. Sylvain Pelletier, the leader of the Pelletier clan, was murdered. His death sent a clear message: anyone who supported the Rock Machine would face the same fate. But instead of intimidating the alliance, Pelletier's death only strengthened their resolve. Harold Pelletier, Sylvain's younger brother, took over leadership of the Pelletier clan and intensified their commitment to fighting the Angels. Escalation and innovation, the Rock Machine fights back. As 1994 turned into 1995, the Rock Machine began to show just how innovative and determined they could be. They weren't just defending their territory. They were actively trying to hurt the Hells Angels' operations and take over their drug markets. The Rock Machine started creating their own puppet clubs to counter the Angels' strategy. They formed the Palmer's MC, with chapters in Montreal and Quebec City, specifically to fight against the Rockers, Evil Ones, and Death Riders. The Palmers were led by Rock Machine members Jean Le Français Ducaire and André Daniel Desrochers. But the Rock Machine's real innovation was in their approach to the drug trade itself. While they were fighting the war, they were also building their own distribution networks and taking over territory that had previously belonged to the Angels. Fred Facher, who became the Rock Machine's national president, was particularly effective at this. His operation was distributing more than 2 kilograms of cocaine per month and generating almost $5 million in profits annually. That's over $8 million in today's money. Fokker alone was earning $250,000 per month from cocaine trafficking. The Rock Machine wasn't just surviving, they were thriving. They were taking market share away from the Hells Angels and proving that the Angels' monopoly could be broken. The public turns. Daniel Desrochers changes everything. But the war came at a terrible cost. The violence escalated throughout 1995, with bombings, shootings, and arsons becoming almost daily occurrences. Both sides were using increasingly powerful explosives, and the violence was spilling over into civilian areas. Then came August 9th, 1995. Daniel Desrochers was playing near his home when a car bomb exploded. The bomb was intended to kill Marc Dubé, a drug dealer who was leaving a Hells Angels clubhouse. But the explosion sent metal shrapnel flying across the street, striking 11-year-old Daniel in the head. Daniel died 4 days later, and his death changed everything. The public, which had largely ignored the biker war as criminals killing criminals, was suddenly outraged. An innocent child had been murdered, and Quebecers demanded action. The government responded by creating Operation Carcajou on October 5, 1995. This was a joint task force combining the best detectives from the RCMP, the Sûreté du Québec, and the Montreal police. Their mission was to end the biker war and bring those responsible for Daniel's death to justice. But despite the increased police pressure, the Rock Machine continued to grow stronger. They were adapting to the new environment and finding ways to continue their operations, despite the law enforcement crackdown. Strategic expansion, taking territory. While the Hells Angels were dealing with increased scrutiny from Operation Carcajou, the Rock Machine was expanding their operations beyond Montreal. They opened new chapters in Quebec City, Beauport, and other areas, spreading their influence across the province. Marcel Demers, who led the Beauport chapter, was particularly successful. His operation was part of the network that was generating those $5 million in annual profits. The Rock Machine was proving that they could not only compete with the Hells Angels, but actually outperform them in certain markets. The Rock Machine's success came from several factors. First, they were hungrier than the Angels. The Hells Angels had grown comfortable with their dominance, while the Rock Machine was fighting for survival and willing to take bigger risks. Second, the Rock Machine was more flexible in their operations. They were willing to work with different criminal organizations and adapt their strategies based on local conditions. The Hells Angels, with their rigid hierarchy and rules, were sometimes slower to respond to changing circumstances. Third, the Rock Machine had better relationships with some local communities. Because they were seen as the underdogs fighting against the established power of the Hells Angels, they sometimes received more cooperation from local criminals and drug dealers who resented the Angels' dominance. International connections, the Bandidos Alliance. By 1999, the Rock Machine had survived 5 years of war with the Hells Angels. They had lost many members, but they had also taken significant territory and market share from the Angels. However, they knew that to truly challenge the Angels' dominance, they needed international support. The opportunity came when the Rock Machine made contact with the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, a Texas-based international organization that was one of the Hells Angels' main rivals worldwide. The Bandidos had chapters across Europe and were looking to expand into Canada. In May 1999, the Rock Machine became a hang-around club for the Bandidos. This meant they were being considered for full membership in the international organization. By December 2000, they had become a probationary chapter, and by December 2001, the Rock Machine officially became the Bandidos Canada. This transformation was huge for the Rock Machine's drug operations. Suddenly, they had access to international drug trafficking networks that the Bandidos had established in Europe and other parts of the world. They could import drugs through different routes and had access to suppliers that the Hells Angels couldn't control. The Bandidos connection also brought new expertise and resources. The international organization had experience fighting the Hells Angels in other countries and could share tactics and strategies that had worked elsewhere. Peak power, the Rock Machine's greatest success. By 2000 and 2001, the Rock Machine had achieved something remarkable. They had not only survived the war with the Hells Angels, but had actually taken over significant portions of the Quebec drug trade. The numbers tell the story. While the Hells Angels were dealing with increased police pressure and internal problems, the Rock Machine was generating millions of dollars in drug profits. Their cocaine distribution network alone was moving over 2 kilograms per month and generating $5 million annually. But it wasn't just about the money. The Rock Machine had proven that the Hells Angels' monopoly could be broken. They had shown that a smaller, more determined organization could challenge and defeat a larger, more established one. The Rock Machine's success attracted attention from other criminal organizations. Independent drug dealers who had been forced to work with the Hells Angels began switching to the Rock Machine. Some Hells Angels members even defected to join the stronger organization. Marcel Demers and Fred Falker, the leaders of the Quebec City and Beauport operations, had built sophisticated drug trafficking networks that rivaled anything the Hells Angels had. They were using legitimate businesses as fronts, laundering money through complex financial networks, and distributing drugs across multiple provinces. The police strike back, Operation Springtime. But the Rock Machine's success also made them a target. On March 28, 2001, police launched Operation Springtime, a massive crackdown that involved 288 searches in 27 locations. The operation targeted 142 individuals, including 80 of Quebec's 106 full-patch Hells Angels members. Operation Springtime was devastating for the Hells Angels. Almost their entire leadership was arrested, including Maurice Boucher and the entire Nomad chapter. This created a power vacuum in Montreal's drug trade, and the Rock Machine was perfectly positioned to fill it. With their main rivals in prison, the Rock Machine expanded their operations rapidly. They took over drug territories that had been controlled by the Angels for years. They recruited new members from the pool of criminals who had previously worked for the arrested Angels. For a brief period, it looked like the Rock Machine had actually won the war. They were the dominant force in Quebec's drug trade, and they had international backing from the Bandidos organization. The final blow, Operation Amigo. But the Rock Machine's triumph was short-lived. The same intelligence networks that had been used to target the Hells Angels were now focused on the Rock Machine and their Bandidos allies. On June 5, 2002, police launched Operation Amigo. This operation had originally been designed to target the Rock Machine during the war, but when the Rock Machine became the Bandidos, they became the primary focus. Operation Amigo was even more devastating than Operation Springtime. The raids led to the arrests of 63 former Rock Machine members, including all of their Quebec leadership and many associates. For the first time since the war began, both sides had their leaders in custody facing serious charges. The timing couldn't have been worse for the Rock Machine. Just as they had achieved their greatest success in taking over the Quebec drug trade, their entire leadership was arrested. Without their leaders, their sophisticated distribution networks began to collapse. The aftermath, victory and defeat. The Quebec Biker War officially ended in 2002, but the question of who really won is complicated. On the surface, it appeared that the Hells Angels had emerged victorious. The Rock Machine as an organization was essentially destroyed by Operation Amigo, and many of their former territories eventually returned to Hells Angels' control. But the Rock Machine had achieved something extraordinary during their 8-year war. They had proven that the Hells Angels were not invincible. They had successfully challenged the most powerful motorcycle club in the world, and had actually taken over significant portions of their drug trade. More importantly, the Rock Machine had changed the landscape of organized crime in Canada forever. They had shown that smaller, more flexible organizations could compete with larger, more established ones. They had demonstrated the importance of strategic alliances and international connections. The drug trafficking networks that the Rock Machine built during the war didn't just disappear when their leaders were arrested. Many of their innovations in drug distribution and money laundering were adopted by other criminal organizations. Their success in challenging the Hells Angels inspired other groups to try similar strategies. Fred Falker and Marcel Demers, before their arrests, had built operations that were generating millions of dollars and challenging the Hells Angels' dominance across Quebec. Their success proved that the Angels' monopoly was not inevitable and that determined competitors could carve out their own empires. the human cost, a war's true price. The Quebec Biker War left an incredible trail of destruction. Over 160 people died during the 8-year conflict. There were more than 80 bombings and 130 cases of arson. Over 200 people were wounded, including many innocent bystanders. Daniel Desrochers became the symbol of the war's human cost. But he wasn't the only innocent victim. Prison guards Diane Lavigne and Pierre Rondeau were murdered as part of Maurice Boucher's campaign to intimidate the justice system. Guy Lemay was killed in a case of mistaken identity. Yves Albert, a father of 2, was shot while filling up his car at a gas station. The violence terrorized the civilian population of Quebec in a way that even the mafia wars of New York had never achieved. Entire neighborhoods lived in fear, never knowing when the next bombing or shooting would occur. But in the middle of this chaos, the Rock Machine had managed to build a criminal empire that rivaled anything the Hells Angels had created. They had taken a billion-dollar drug trade and carved out their own significant piece of it. Legacy and lessons. What the Rock Machine achieved. The story of the Rock Machine's challenge to the Hells Angels offers several important lessons about organized crime and the drug trade. First, it showed that monopolies in the drug trade are fragile. Even the most powerful criminal organizations can be challenged by smaller, more determined competitors. The Hells Angels seemed invincible in 1994, but within a few years, the Rock Machine had taken over significant portions of their territory. Second, it demonstrated the importance of strategic alliances. The Rock Machine couldn't have survived without the alliance against the Angels and later, the Bandidos connection. These partnerships provided the resources and support they needed to compete with a larger organization. Third, it proved that innovation and flexibility can overcome size and tradition. The Rock Machine was always smaller than the Hells Angels, but they were more willing to try new strategies and adapt to changing circumstances. The Rock Machine's drug trafficking operations, at their peak, were generating millions of dollars annually and challenging the Hells Angels across multiple markets. They had proven that the Angels' dominance was not inevitable and that determined competitors could build their own criminal empires. The modern era, echoes of the past. The Quebec Biker War officially ended in 2002, but its effects are still being felt today. The Rock Machine was reformed in 2007 and continues to operate as an international motorcycle club with chapters around the world. The Hells Angels remain active in Canada, but they never again achieved the level of dominance they had before the war. The conflict showed law enforcement new ways to target organized crime, and it showed other criminal organizations that the Angels could be challenged. The drug trafficking techniques that the Rock Machine developed during the war have been adopted by other organizations. Their success in building international connections and sophisticated distribution networks became a model for other criminal enterprises. More importantly, the Rock Machine's story became a symbol of resistance against criminal monopolies. They showed that even the most powerful organizations have weaknesses, and that determined competitors can exploit those weaknesses to build their own empires. Conclusion: the price of power. The story of how the Rock Machine took over Canada's drug trade from the Hells Angels is ultimately a story about power, ambition, and the terrible cost of both. For 8 years, these two organizations turned Quebec into a battlefield, fighting over $1 billion drug trade that corrupted communities and destroyed lives. The Rock Machine succeeded in their goal of challenging the Hells Angels' dominance. They built a criminal empire that generated millions of dollars and controlled significant territory. They proved that the Angels were not invincible and that their monopoly could be broken. But that success came at an incredible price. Over 160 people died in the war, including innocent victims like Daniel Desrochers. Hundreds more were wounded. Entire communities lived in fear. The violence was so intense that it forced the government to rewrite Canada's criminal laws and create new police units specifically designed to combat organized crime. In the end, both organizations lost. The Hells Angels saw their leadership imprisoned and their monopoly broken. The Rock Machine achieved their goal of taking over the drug trade, but their victory was short-lived as their own leaders were arrested and their organization dismantled. The only winners were the new criminal organizations that learned from both groups' successes and failures. They adopted the Rock Machine's innovations while avoiding their mistakes. They used the chaos caused by the war to build their own criminal empires. Today, Daniel Desrochers is remembered by a memorial plaque and the anti-criminal organization laws that bear his name. His death became the symbol of a war that showed the terrible price of unchecked criminal ambition. The Rock Machine's brief dominance over Canada's drug trade proved that even the most powerful criminal organizations can be challenged and defeated. But it also showed that in the world of organized crime, victory often comes at a price that no one should have to pay. The Quebec Biker War changed Canada forever. It showed that criminal organizations could wage war in the heart of civilized society, and it demonstrated the terrible human cost of that violence. But it also proved that no criminal empire, no matter how powerful, is permanent. And in the shadows of that lesson, new organizations continue to fight over the same drug trade, using the same methods and paying the same terrible price. The Rock Machine may have taken over Canada's drug trade from the Hells Angels, but the cycle of violence and ambition continues, with new players learning the same dark lessons that Daniel Desrochers paid for with his life.